Welcome to See You on the Other Side, where the world of the mysterious collides with the world of entertainment. A discussion of art, music, movies, spirituality, the weird, and self-discovery. And now, your hosts, musicians and entertainers who have their own weakness for the weird, Mike and Wendy from the band Sunspot.
Hello, listener. Welcome back. I hope you had a great week since we last got together here. I'm not going to talk too long here because, once again, Mike's got a really great interview for you. And the gentleman that he talks to is not only incredibly interesting and intelligent, but he's also got a great accent. So I enjoyed every aspect of this interview. But first, just a quick announcement. It's episode 60 already here. And I don't know if you remember because it was 10 episodes ago, which means basically 10 weeks ago. It was episode 50. And we had a little contest where we asked you if you would tweet your favorite episode along with the hashtag OtherSide50. And of the responses that we got, we drew a couple that are now prize winners. So I just wanted to congratulate the two winners that we have here. And that would be Amphibian, whose favorite episode was episode 43. And that was Bigfoot and Aliens and Ghosts Oh My, behind the scenes at Milwaukee Paranormal Conference 2015, which also I think was one of my favorite episodes because it was just a lot of fun meeting people and talking with friends that are in the same scene. So congratulations, Amphibian, and thank you for sharing that. And our other winner is John Dryzga, whose favorite episode was episode 26, How the Occult Saved Rock and Roll, an interview with Peter Biebergal. So congratulations, guys. I will be sending you a Sunspot t-shirt and the brand new Sunspot CD, Weirdest Hits, which is 18 tracks of songs that many of which were inspired by this very podcast and the discussions we have in it. So you guys will be receiving a message from us on Twitter, and we'll get your addresses and send you those goodies out. So thanks again for listening. And we are approaching our 1-year anniversary, so we'll probably have another chance for some prizes coming up real soon here. But that's enough about that. It's time for the interview. I'm going to hand off the podcast to Mike and Robbie Graham.
We are with author Robbie Graham, who's just come out with a brand new book, Silver Screen Saucers, and he's joining us today from Surrey in the United Kingdom. How you doing today, Robbie?
Hey, I'm good, thanks. It's good to be with you, and I'm looking forward to getting into this.
Absolutely. Okay. So, Silver Screen Saucers is about the connection between cinema and UFO phenomena. So for a paranormal and pop culture podcast, this is just about the perfect topic for us. But Robbie, what got you interested in that kind of stuff in the first place?
Well, I've, like many people, had a long-standing fascination with all things weird and wonderful, and this dates back to my childhood, not from personal experience, just through I guess, natural curiosity. And so I was, from an early age, interested in things like ghosts and cryptozoology, and but only in a passing way. And then I kind of got interested in UFOs in my teens, about 14, 15 years old. And then by my early 20s, I'd become, like so many people do with UFOs, obsessed, because it's that kind of a subject. It invites obsession. And, of course, life got in the way, and I was doing other things then. By this point, I'd started to do film studies at an academic level. And so that was the other passion of my life. And so UFOs always kind of got put on the back burner. And, I just continued to progress with my academic studies in film and media. And then in my mid to late 20s, I decided finally that I should merge these two interests. And I started to write a little bit about cinema and UFOs. And so my research for what would become Silver Screen Saucers really started around 9 years ago. And the writing process actually began around 7 years ago. So it's been a long process to get this book together.
Yeah, I guess. I'm a film major too, or was a film major, when I was in college 1,000 years ago. So what were your favorite kind of movies? What inspired? Did you want to make movies, or were you interested in just being a critic and writing about film and film theory?
I think for a time I like the idea of being the next Steven Spielberg.
Okay.
And
Close Encounters of the Third Kind right there. I mean, that's...
Of course, yeah, Mr. UFO Spielberg, and so yeah, I mean, I made a few short student movies and all that kind of stuff, and I went to the New York Film Academy and all that kind of stuff, and I thought about maybe going into the practical side of filmmaking, but ultimately I realized that I was better writing about films than making them, and so yeah, it was the theory side of it really appealed to me, the analytical side of it.
All right. So it took, 7 years to write this book. How was the research process of it? Because you took time to work on it, and what did you do to get into for the research of it?
Well, there's not a lot. I mean, to date, there's only been 2 previous books that have been written which have been dedicated exclusively to the exploration of the interplay between UFOs and Hollywood. And those were both written in the late 1990s. Since then, there's been no book devoted exclusively to looking at UFOs and Hollywood, although many books and many researchers have talked about Hollywood. But it's been largely speculative, and people don't really, what I found quite quickly was that, when I started writing the book, I thought, it's someone else is going to churn out another book on this subject before I can finish this, because surely there must be dozens of people working on books about UFOs in Hollywood, because it seems such a natural subject to explore, because the two seem to be inseparable, really. And then I realized that it's easier said than done to write a book on this subject, because it requires a detailed knowledge of the history of the UFO phenomenon and ufology, the field that studies it, but also it requires a detailed understanding of the cinema industry, how the cinema industry works, how it operates, and the history of government involvement in the industry of propaganda, history of the science fiction genre, the evolution of the genre. And so it began as a PhD in 2009. I'd already started writing articles on the subject in about 2007. It wasn't until 2009 that I started on a PhD dedicated to this, and then it eventually morphed into something more populist, because ultimately I couldn't really do what I wanted to do, even though I did 3 years on the PhD.
Well, so you were going to become a doctor of UFO movies, which sounds like the greatest doctor ever. That's almost Doctor Who level of greatest doctors ever.
Yeah. Yeah, and ultimately pointless, because I made the decision ultimately that it wasn't the right road for me, and I'm more of a populist writer than an academic one. Although I was, I suppose, good enough to have got to the stage that I'd got with it, and I was getting support from my supervisors, although initially they'd been resistant to the idea, understandably, because academia is not sympathetic to any weird field, especially UFOs.
No, not anymore.
From the outset, I'd stated in my proposal that that this was not going to be some abstract cultural PhD wherein I talk about UFOs purely as product of audience culture. I was stating from the outset that this is going to take the position that UFOs, whatever they are genuinely anomalous, and that there is a real mystery underlying this phenomenon, and that governments around the world take the subject very seriously, and that so I'm going to address this as something that's tangible, and that provoked some resistance. But ultimately, they did support me, but after a while, I just decided that I didn't need to do the PhD to do the book, because the book was the ultimate goal, and I left my previous job, which was a college lecturer in media, to do the PhD, and because I thought that doing the PhD was a good out. It was a good kind of legitimate escape route from the job that I was finding boring at the time.
Yeah, sure.
In order to pursue the dream of doing of exploring UFOs in Hollywood in a kind of a legitimate way. And so the goal was a book, and I thought, well, the PhD is a good route to a book, but around 2 years into the PhD, a Hollywood producer called Bryce Zabel, who was the creator of the 1990s TV show called Dark Skies.
Oh, I used to love that show. I mean, wasn't Art Bell even on Dark Skies? Wasn't he a character for a cameo?
Yeah, it drew extensively from UFO literature and debate, because Bryce Zabel was and is a UFO believer, for lack of a better word. He's been fascinated by the subject for many years, and he kind of tried to incorporate every aspect of UFO mythology into that series. Anyway, I met Bryce in 2011, and he proposed that we write a book together on this subject. So we started to explore that idea, and eventually Bryce just sort of stepped back and said, "Look, you go ahead and write this," and he would write the foreword for the book, which is what's happened. It would the idea was that it would work better with one voice rather than two, because Bryce has worked within the industry, but I'm looking at it from the outside, and so we had kind of quite different perspectives on the industry itself as well. I'm quite critical of Hollywood. I love Hollywood. I mean, I love what it puts out. I mean, well, not all of it by a long shot. But,
right. No, absolutely.
I love Hollywood, but there's plenty to criticize.
Well, that's probably a good position to start with when we talk about your book. When you say that there's plenty to criticize. So, what do you think? What is the number one thing you think that Hollywood has gotten wrong about UFO visitations, or or when they take a based on true events kind of story? What do you think the number one thing they got wrong is?
Well, generally speaking, I mean, first of all, it's important to state that there is a preconception or a myth that the UFO phenomenon and UFO culture has been sprung from and feeds off UFO movies and UFO entertainment media, whereas in actual fact, it's largely the reverse. It's vice versa. What happens is the UFO phenomenon, whatever it represents, predates entertainment media depictions of it. And so the phenomenon as we know it today in its modern form began in 1947, and then Hollywood engaged with the phenomenon in sort of 1949, 1950. And then what happened was you had stories, UFO stories that came out from witnesses. Basically, you had grassroots reports from people around the world, particularly in the United States, and Hollywood caught on to this and they recognized that this was a growing cultural hysteria, and it's also political hysteria as well. It was treated very seriously behind the scenes in the US government in the Cold War and beyond.
Sure, because it could have been Russian spy planes or something like that.
Right, but also, I mean, even as early as 1948, the Air Force had concluded in its first study for Project Sign, which was an official UFO project called Project Sign, which would later become Blue Book. They concluded as early as 1948 that the phenomenon was actually probably interplanetary, and that's their term, in nature. This report so alarmed the chief of the Air Force, Hoyt Vandenberg, that he ordered all copies burned, and because he didn't want that to be the official position of the Air Force. A few copies survived, which was seen by the head of the project, a guy called Edward Ruppelt, and he publicized this in his first book in 1956-55. So this was something that was really freaking people out behind the scenes. People were reporting objects which were moving at incredible speeds and performing impossible aerial maneuvers, and so there were theories: is it Soviet? Is it some kind of weird natural phenomena? Is it extraterrestrial? These are all questions that were being asked, and so beginning in sort of 1953, the CIA recommended that the national security apparatus begin an effort to debunk and demystify UFOs through media channels. That entertainment media should be exploited to basically manage perceptions of the phenomenon.
Okay.
So this started to be enacted throughout the Cold War, and there's some evidence to suggest that some of these recommendations were acted upon in the 50s and 60s, and then it starts to get more speculative as to where that agenda went. But certainly there's concrete evidence to show that right from the get-go, the CIA and the Air Force in particular viewed Hollywood as the perfect conduit through which to manage and manipulate popular perceptions of a phenomenon that was of grave concern to them.
To spread disinformation.
It encompasses, the term I use is perception management, because it encompasses disinformation and propaganda. The initial goal of it, according to the CIA, was to debunk and demystify, to get people not to believe in this subject at all. But as I've said elsewhere, I think that very quickly they realized that it was impossible to completely debunk and demystify a phenomenon that continued to manifest itself spectacularly around the world. And if people are continuing to see these things, then you can't really convince people that they don't exist. So what you can do is you can attempt to manage how people perceive the phenomenon. So I think that there have been some very sophisticated efforts put into play over the years along those lines, and I explore those in the book. I mean, the book is kind of two-pronged. It's both cultural and conspiratorial. So I do look at the historical evidence for involvement in these movies in an official capacity and monitoring of them and manipulation of them, which is limited. It's not extensive, it's limited. By and large, this is a natural cultural phenomenon. Hollywood's engagement and obsession with UFOs, dating back to the 50s, is a natural cultural process. People have always been fascinated by the idea of life in the universe. Are we alone? It's one of the oldest questions, the oldest philosophical questions. And I think ultimately the appeal of these movies is that they visualize, they contextualize, and they narrativize a subject, an idea that's otherwise hard, if not impossible, to comprehend. The idea of alien life and visitation is a weighty one, but through cinema, it's simplified and through genre conventions. And I guess ultimately it's made digestible and enjoyable. And that's why Hollywood continues to make these movies.
Well, what would you say would be the first flying saucer film, the first UFO movie?
The first UFO movie released theatrically was in 1950, and that was called The Flying Saucer. It was, shameless cash-in on the growing hysteria, the growing flying saucer hysteria that began in 1947. It was a low-budget movie, and right away this film attracted the attention of the Air Force. The director, a guy called Mikhail Conrad, had stated publicly to press that he had footage of a real flying saucer that he was using in his movie. And the Air Force the Air Force Office of Special Investigations immediately opened a file on him, and they did an investigation into him, and they sent one of their officers to actually attend the premiere of his movie just in case there was a real UFO in there. And then afterwards they debriefed him and basically double-checked that he didn't really have this footage, and of course it turned out that he didn't have this footage. It was just a marketing scam to kind of make it more...
Right, get people out. There's real footage of a UFO, and the only place you're going to see it is if you go see the flying saucer.
But this established right from the beginning this interest in Hollywood on the part of interest in saucer movies rather on the part of officialdom, and this is something that continued right throughout the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and right up to the present day. In fact, I mean, you still got the Transformers movies, Battleship, Battle Los Angeles. All of these films received actually full military cooperation, and what that means is that they have access to the script in a big way creatively. They can actually shape the content of these scripts. They can write dialogue. They can create story arcs, and in return, they give in return for this creative freedom, they give the filmmakers access to their hardware, their technology, and their advice. And so it's this kind of symbiotic relationship between Hollywood and the Pentagon, which has gone back for many decades now, but which has intensified over the years. And
well, a lot of the directors, I mean, you think about a lot of the directors in the 1950s, they had been in the service, like even guys like John Huston and stuff, had been in the service of the military during the Second World War, producing documentaries for the U.S. Army.
Exactly. So it was not at all unusual for many filmmakers during the 50s, 60s and beyond to have had military backgrounds. And that's actually interesting in relation to the 1951 film, The Day the Earth Stood Still. This was actually the first movie, really. This was the first big budget, glossy studio product to deal with UFOs. And it was one of the only such products of its time. Most UFO movies throughout the Cold War were low budget B movies, and they were kind of schlocky products aimed at teens at the drive-in. This was a serious piece of filmmaking from director Robert Wise, and it had the full support of Darryl Zanuck, who was the head of 20th Century Fox. Zanuck was himself in the Army Signal Corps during the war, as was the screenwriter for The Day the Earth Stood Still, a guy called Edmund North, and so was the producer Julian Blaustein. So they all had military backgrounds, and or propagandist backgrounds specifically within the military. They all worked within the propaganda corps. And Zanuck also, at the time of The Day the Earth Stood Still's production, was actually also a CIA asset. He was close friends with a guy called C.D. Jackson, Charles Douglas Jackson, who was the government's chief propagandist at the time. And so they had intimate relationships, and Jackson had actually referred to Zanuck publicly, or privately rather, it later became public, as one of a group of friends, including Walt Disney and Jack Warner, who the government could rely upon to insert into their scripts the right ideas with the proper subtlety when called upon. So Hollywood was used as a conduit by the CIA going back to the 50s. This is very well documented, to manage perceptions not of UFOs specifically, and indeed there's no evidence on paper relating to UFOs in the 1950s where Hollywood is concerned.
Sure.
But there is concrete proof that Warner Brothers, for example, Paramount Studios, the head of censorship at Paramount Studios in the 1950s was a guy called Luigi Larashi, and he was a CIA asset, and he was literally working for the CIA and on their payroll, and they would request that he make changes or recommendations for changes in studio products from Paramount Studios throughout the 1950s, and he did so routinely to manage public perceptions of hot-button national security issues, of policy issues, race relations, colonial history, etc., etc. So the thing is that, if these changes were being made over such, mundane things, relatively mundane, then you would have thought that such efforts would extend to the national security issue of UFOs. And undoubtedly they did, and there is circumstantial evidence to show that they did. So The Day the Earth Stood Still was an interesting one, and there's been rumours for years about whether or not this film acted as a CIA acclimation project to the idea of UFO reality, and there's no concrete proof. There's just circumstantial evidence. There are a number of films over the years from the government angle that you can point to conclusively and say we know for sure that this branch of the military was involved in that film and made these changes to it, and the result was, A, B, or C. And there are some very interesting examples spanning the decades.
Let's get a couple of those examples, because when you said The Day the Earth Stood Still, that would be, I kind of think of the first thoughtful, at least, UFO visitors from outer space kind of movie, because it's not low budget schlock. You look at it now and you're like, okay, some things are pretty cheesy and stuff like that, but it's still a great movie. Robert Wise obviously directed a ton of great, genre films over the years, from The Haunting to Star Trek. And but you think of The Day the Earth Stood Still, and you would not think that would be a necessarily have any kind of relationship when you talk about the guys, the producer, being military, Daryl Zanuck and stuff, because it seems to be such a not necessarily military, but it's definitely an anti-war film.
Yeah, and this is very unusual, of course. But actually, the script notes. You can look at. That's one of the main ways that cultural critics engage with The Day the Earth Stood Still. For example, they look at it in terms of its political commentary, and that's and that's valid, of course.
Sure.
And that's how most cultural critics engage with UFO movies or sci-fi movies of the 50s. They look at them as communist allegory, as political commentary, and indeed they were. But what almost all cultural critics overlook when analysing these 1950s sci-fi, specifically flying saucer movies, is the most blatant inspiration for the movies, which was not communism but flying saucers. So this is absent from most film analyses of this genre.
I guess that's a good way to put it too, because they do make the aliens sympathetic in The Day the Earth Stood Still. And if you guys at home, if you haven't seen The Day the Earth Stood Still yet, do not bother with the Keanu Reeves version. It's not that bad, but just go back to the 1951 version. And also, a little trivia, that's Bruce Campbell when he says Klaatu Verata Nikto in Army of Darkness. That's where it comes from, The Day the Earth Stood Still, because the name of the killer alien robot is Klaatu. So anyway, if you're playing along at home, as soon as you're done with this podcast, jump on Netflix and check it out.
Yeah, the alien is Klaatu. The robot is Gore.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah,
that's right.
But no, it's a great film, and it's it really lives up to repeat viewings, and it's fascinating ufologically because you've got parallels with UFO reports and later contactee reports. So you had a ufological movement, I guess, throughout the 1950s and 60s, referred to as the Contactee Movement, which involved people like George Adamski and Howard Menger and others who claimed frequent intimate contact with races of human-looking, beautiful space beings who espoused messages of peace and love and anti-nuke. They were nuke-intolerant beings who were worried about the state of mankind and issued warnings. And so they were very much like Klaatu from the day the Earth stood still. And the technology that these contactees reported the aliens had were these sleek-looking flying saucers which emitted a uniform glow, which people have associated with ionized air based on propulsion systems, all this kind of stuff. This has emerged in later years in ufology.
Sure.
But all of these details are there in the movie. This was the first film to depict a flying saucer as reported by witnesses, basically something that was simple, sleek, that was not some clunky-looking contraption, as appeared in the first flying saucer movie from 1950, for example. This film seemed to be right on the money with its ufological detail, and this is why it continues to be the subject of speculation in the UFO community. Was it seeded with inside information to acclimate people, etc., etc.? So there's no solid answers to those questions, but there is circumstantial evidence which continues to fuel debate. There are some other interesting, far more concrete cases. So, for example, in 1971, a filmmaker in the US called Robert Emenegger, a documentarian, who was formerly the creative director at Grey Advertising. If anyone's seen the TV show Mad Men, with Don Draper in that show as creative director of whatever, I can't even remember the name of the
Sterling Price, Cooper Draper. They have they go through several different name changes.
So Robert Emenegger, was the creative director at Grey Advertising, which is actually mentioned in Mad Men. So he was the real-life Don Draper.
Awesome.
A man of considerable influence.
Probably drank less.
Yeah, with lots of. Well, actually, he told me that watching Mad Men was actually like watching his life throughout. But except he could never remember drinking that much. But he was a guy who was approached. So he later became a documentarian, and he was approached through his production partner, a guy called Alan Sandler, who had CIA connections and FBI connections. This guy brought to him a project from the Air Force, and the Air Force wanted their assistance in making a documentary about UFOs, a serious documentary about UFOs. And they said that, look, we're actually going to furnish you with real UFO footage, not only real UFO footage, but alien landing footage shot at Holloman Air Force Base by the Air Force, filmed sometime in the early 70s, late 60s. And it depicts alien beings exiting a craft and meeting with delegates of the US government and going away into some hangar somewhere. And Emenegger had no interest in UFOs, and he was very skeptical about this. And they said, look, the footage is real, and we're going to give it to you. And so what happened was the Air Force and every branch of the US military, in fact, and NASA opened their doors to Emenegger and Sandler, and these guys had carte blanche to go anywhere they want. And they for months they had access to these Air Force bases, to Norton Air Force Base and Holloman Air Force Base, very sensitive Air Force bases in America.
Yeah.
And they had sit-down interviews with all of the heads of the Air Force's Project Blue Book, the UFO study project. They met with generals and colonels, and it was bizarre. And all the while, this footage was being dangled over them. And then at the last minute, by the time the movie was ready to be released, which was 1974, late 73 or sometime in 73,
sure,
the Watergate scandal was starting to break. And they said, look, with what's going on politically, we can't actually give you this footage anymore because it's too much for the American public to cope with, Nixon and aliens. And so so they said, we can't give it to you. And so Emenegger was really frustrated by it. But he said, look, during the production, they were actually shown footage of a UFO flying or kind of darting behind a missile that's being shot into space from Holloman Air Force Base.
Okay.
And they were shown all sorts of stuff, and they were shown artistic recreations of the artistic drawings of the aliens, based on it. And they spoke to people at the base who claimed to have seen the landing footage. But they never saw it themselves. And this is just one of a number of examples over the years where footage has been offered to filmmakers by the Air Force and then withdrawn at the last minute. There's at least 2 or 3 other cases going back to the 50s.
Why do you think they would do that? Like, I mean, what would be the impetus behind dangling that on several different occasions or stringing these people along for a little while? Because it sounds like that might be a disinformation or a managed perception move on its own.
Yeah, and here's where we really get into Twilight Zone territory, because
all right,
if we weren't there already, it sounds crazy.
That's okay. It's okay. We don't judge until afterwards.
But the only logical conclusion I can draw, and this is not just my conclusion, a number of other people have reached this conclusion before me and have done very good research along these lines. And one of those guys is Mark Pilkington, who made a good documentary called Mirage Men, looking at this whole disinformation angle regarding UFOs. But my position is that ultimately that there's a genuinely kind of strange, mystifying phenomenon underlying UFOs, that despite the many decades of research, private research on the part of various government branches into this subject, no solid conclusions have been drawn, and the phenomenon ultimately defies understanding. And therefore, you can never really publicly release something that you don't fully understand, because all you're releasing is ignorance.
Right. The fact that you don't know anything is probably scarier than that you'd be covering up something that you do know.
Now, this is not to say that they don't have serious interest and they don't have some ideas. They may well, I'm sure they do. I'm sure they have theories and ideas, but then that's not proof. I think the phenomenon continues to elude private science as it does public science and UFO believers everywhere. And so, again, it relates to perception management. The phenomenon persists, and and public interest in it continues to persist. People are intent on believing in the idea of a grand UFO conspiracy, that the government has been hiding information, which to an extent it certainly has. I mean, this is documented. In the early years, they denied any interest or knowledge at all. And then, of course, when the Freedom of Information Act kicked in, hundreds of thousands of documents have since been released showing that every branch of the government was secretly looking at this for many years. So there has been a secrecy, whether you want to call that a cover-up is up to you, but there's been high levels of secrecy surrounding the subject, and certainly there's been official interest. So, but again, interest and research does not equate to conclusions and ultimate knowledge. And so ultimately what you have to do is manage perceptions, not specifically of the phenomenon, but perceptions of your involvement in the phenomenon. And so if you can steer this for a psychological warfare purpose, directed not against the American people necessarily, although that can also come into play, but against foreign powers. So in the Cold War, you had a documentary made in 1988 called UFO Cover-Up Live, which is this is another one of those cases where you had, government involvement in a product, in an entertainment product essentially, but it was a documentary, and they seeded this script with information, and the whole production was really steered by intelligence operatives within the Air Force Office of Special Investigation, and this is very well documented by now, and again, this is something that I look at in the book. And how you can trace back a certain core story and mythology to around the early 1980s, and this story that emerges, all traceable back to the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, is this idea that various branches of officialdom have for years had treaties and ongoing based dialogues with UFO intelligences, with aliens, with extraterrestrials, and that they have working relationships with them. They have reverse engineered their technology, that they have thousands of functioning craft that can fly to space and to Mars, and that basically you've got an ultra advanced kind of faction of officialdom, which is in league with one or more species of aliens. Now, this idea is central to UFO conspiracy culture today, but it actually traces back to the early 1980s with the emergence of these so-called Majestic 12 documents, which have been used in all sorts of pop culture products, from Dark Skies, The X-Files, and many others. These leaked documents, which are actually fabrications created by the intelligence community to sow ideas into this community about UFOs and official involvement in the field. And it creates this false impression of actually the powers that be having a really deep understanding of this phenomenon. But it's something that can never actually be proven or debated in a serious sphere, because it's tainted with the UFO brush because, if, official culture doesn't accept UFO reality. It doesn't accept that. But I mean, official culture doesn't even accept the notion of conspiracies as being something that's
Right.
that's a thing. So it can never be debated seriously outside of conspiracy culture. So it's no threat to them. But what it does do is it sows particular ideas into conspiracy culture, and the conspiracy culture inevitably bleeds into pop culture, which is what always happens. Subculture and fringe culture eventually bleeds into pop culture, and that's especially so with ufology, because cinema has been central to this. Cinema has taken ideas from ufology and it's popularized them. So, ideas like Men in Black, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, of the Fourth Kind, Area 51, Roswell, all of these things were part of the common language of ufology decades before Hollywood lifted them and popularized them.
Absolutely. And I think the first time I heard of those things, a lot of it was at that UFO Cover-Up Live event. Because I just looked it up and I realized I watched this when I was like 11 years old.
Okay.
I'm like, it's got the guy from MASH is in it and stuff. I'm like, no, I saw this.
It's completely bizarre watching it because so I speak to Tracy Torme in the book. He's a screenwriter. He was actually a producer on the show. He didn't write it, but he was hired to write it and to produce it, but he refused to write it because he was actually on a writer's strike at the time. But he was there from the inside, and so he kind of gave his inside perspective of the production of that show. And he said, right from the get-go, this was hijacked essentially by Air Force intelligence, and they got wind that a show was being produced about UFOs and conspiracies, and the Air Force, they wanted in on this, and it was done through an Air Force intelligence operative called Richard Doty, and through his superior, a guy called Harry Rositsky, who was a very senior CIA or retired CIA guy, and this was something that clearly had been signed off on at a high level, and the goal was to sow ideas into the UFO community and to see how they spread. And this has psychological warfare applications domestically as well as overseas, because if you can sow particular ideas into a manageable small community, a tight-knit community, you can actually see how things are spread, who's spreading things, how they're being spread, etc., etc. So you can throw some truth in there if you want, because that's how disinformation works. So there must be some kind of nugget of truth in what they're putting out.
There's a little bit you can believe, because if there's a little bit you can believe,
right,
then you can make the leap to the next thing. And I see exactly what you're talking about, because if the Ruskies thought that the United States was in league with these alien superpowers.
That is precisely it. I'm convinced that was the goal, and now it's extended to other, enemy foreign powers as well. So it's not just Russia now, but because these other foreign powers, they were at the same time they were investigating UFOs secretly as well, and there's some plenty of documentation to show this. And some governments are actually very open about the fact of their historical UFO investigations. This was a global phenomenon. So it wasn't just restricted to America. So certainly Russia was looking at this secretly for decades, and they'd drawn the same conclusions as America. This was not American. It wasn't some other terrestrial power, and it could very well have been extraterrestrial or interdimensional or God knows what. It was just not human necessarily. And these were ideas being thrown around. So it wouldn't have been a huge leap for certain elements within the Russian military, for example, or other militaries, to actually have thought, maybe the Americans do have crashed spacecraft. Maybe they do have treaties with aliens. Maybe we shouldn't mess with these guys because maybe they're super advanced.
Right. They've got a death ray that we don't know about.
Right. And actually, it becomes far more plausible, this theory, when you look at the content of UFO Cover-Up Live. This was one of the first productions ever to be broadcast simultaneously in America and the Soviet Union. It was broadcast simultaneously in those countries, and it actually has on-screen involvement from Soviet scientists, and they're on screen. They're live on screen in the show. And Mike Farrell, the MASH guy, makes a point of reading from a script, by the way, because literally every line in the show is scripted.
Of course.
But even though it's live, it's all scripted. And the reason it was scripted was because the producer, Michael Seligman, was so terrified by what he'd been told by Air Force intelligence that he was convinced that all this is real, that there was probably an impending alien invasion, and that the government was, it was a very cloak and dagger X-Files stuff, and he was spooked really badly. This is according to the producer, Tracy Torme. And by this point, Seligman said, look, we know this is supposed to be live, but I don't want anyone saying anything that they're not supposed to say on screen.
Right. We might ruin the treaty between the U.S. and the aliens.
He was apparently really freaked out, and so watching the show is completely a surreal experience because everyone's reading robotically from a script and pretending to be, naturalistic. So that was a really important production because it was one of the first. It was a demonstration of how seriously the powers that be essentially regard entertainment media and TV and regard factual or entertainment TV and film. They recognize these as being hugely important conduits in the dissemination of propaganda and disinformation. And if you want to control how people perceive anything, then you have to control the medium. And that's why they had their hooks in it. And that's why the CIA involvement in Hollywood goes back to the 1950s. And DOD involvement in Hollywood goes back even further and continues to this day.
Okay, so now if we come to a more modern era, and that's awesome. You're talking about that UFO cover-up live. I love that stuff. That's how I first heard about the Area 51 was specials like that used to run syndicated on the UHF stations when we were kids in the middle of the U.S. and you didn't have the internet. How would you hear about Area 51 or all the stuff that George Knapp uncovered?
It's crucial that you mention Area 51 there because, again, that was the first time that Area 51 had ever been mentioned in any TV or film medium. It was mentioned in text form fleetingly in UFO Cover-Up Live, and the idea of naval intelligence being responsible for Area 51 and the UFO secrecy was all started to be fed into UFO Cover-Up Live, and the idea of treaties and aliens and terminology EBE and Majestic 12, all these things were there thrust into this show. And then these things started to become central to ufology in the years that followed, and a huge distraction essentially for UFO research. All of these things were planted by Air Force and probably CIA, but Area 51, that was so this was 1988, and then literally 1 year later, Bob Lazar, the whistleblower who brought Area 51 to the world, essentially, his story came out less than a year after that show, and his employment at the base actually began 4 months after the broadcast of UFO Cover-Up Live. And I'm convinced that the Area 51 story was part of an extension of this kind of phase 2 of this whole strategy. And I mean, it sounds very far-fetched, I recognize, but you can eventually put pieces together. And if that was the goal, and we can't say definitively that it was, to create this myth, then It's been extremely successful. It's been extremely successful. Now, again, I want to emphasize to any kind of UFO people out there that I'm not a disbeliever in this phenomenon. I've interviewed enough people and researched enough on this topic for enough years to recognize that there's something really profound underlying it. I don't draw many conclusions beyond that. And certainly elements of the government have been investigating this for many years and will have some ideas, their own ideas about what it represents. But there's no way they can disclose any of this because they don't fully understand it. And so I think holding out a mass disclosure event is futile. But
when you talk about Area 51, like, to me that feels like they introduced that. No, I mean, after the Hangar 18 stuff kind of went stale. Like in the 70s, and you have like Hangar 18, and this is where they're doing the research, and this is where they're keeping the flying saucers. And then after that kind of gets old, well, now we got something at Groom Lake in Nevada.
Well, if they did have anything, that's where it would be, or that's where it would have been. There's actually places now that there are more secure and secretive than Area 51. Area 51 is like the most public, most well-known secret place in the world.
Right.
But for a time it was the most secret place, and certainly that's where they would have studied something like that. And I'm sure no one doubts that there are some exotic technologies at Area 51, whether they're man-made or alien, we don't know. But certainly there are exotic technologies out there. That's the whole purpose of the base. And my contention as well is that Bob Lazar actually did work there, and he was employed there, but he was employed unwittingly as a disinformation conduit. He was there to do for a purpose, and his purpose was to blow the whistle. He was shown very, very specific things whilst he was there, which were clearly staged for him. Even Lazar is of the opinion that a lot of what he saw there was, or at least some of what he saw there was orchestrated for him, and that they were playing with his head. So it's my contention that Lazar was actually at Area 51, and again, there's a lot of evidence to support that fact.
Right.
But what he saw there was staged for him, so that he would blow the whistle and he would put out a story to the world and to foreign powers that this is indeed what's happening, that there is an intimate relationship, that there is hardware, alien hardware, and that the military has a real deep understanding of this stuff. So there's psychological warfare angle to all of this.
And that fueled, this fueled all through the 1990s conspiracy theories.
Absolutely.
The rise of the X-Files and Art Bell and Coast to Coast and George Knapp, who still does Sundays on Coast to Coast and who's got the greatest radio voice ever, I think. Like all those guys, it fueled careers and like the culture.
Yeah, George. I mean, I spent some time with George Knapp last year, and George actually endorses my book, and I think he's a brilliant guy, and he knows Bob Lazar because he was the guy, because George Knapp was the reporter that broke the story. And George Knapp doesn't really draw many conclusions on the Lazar case. He continues to be baffled by it, but is pretty convinced that Lazar was there and is telling the truth as he saw it. But the truth that he tells is not necessarily the truth, or is certainly not the whole truth. But there's a disinformation angle at play here, and but ultimately, I mean, you can, and the temptation with all this kind of stuff is, with this kind of intrigue, is you can get so bogged down in it that you could write a whole book on it but get nowhere. So I devote essentially one chapter to this idea of a Hollywood UFO conspiracy. I flag it up a few other times throughout the book, but essentially I've got one dedicated chapter to this. The rest of the book is largely cultural in its focus rather than conspiratorial, because I think that's more valuable ultimately.
Okay.
Because you have to look at the cultural processes involved here, and how Hollywood, how Hollywood draws from a subculture, a fringe belief system essentially. Because I mean, ufology, although UFOs are demonstrably, I guess, real, for lack of a better word, and they're sprung from our lived historical reality.
Well, people have real experience. I mean, they have experiences that are real to them. I've known plenty of people that have seen a UFO,
right,
and whether or not it was an alien or something else, they absolutely believe they saw something that they cannot explain.
Right, and some of these experiences are quite profound and physical. Again, there's perhaps extraterrestrials is too simplistic an explanation, but ultimately, Hollywood draws from the debate and the literature and the subculture, and by kind of being a parasite towards all of this stuff, it actually fictionalizes it, but at the same time it actualizes it. And this is this paradox, this is this dichotomy that I look at, and I kind of contextualize within the framework of what I refer to as hyperreality. This is a cultural theory that already exists, but I've applied it to UFOs, and it's the notion that consciousness is unable or unwilling to distinguish between something that's real and something that's fiction or something that's fantasy.
Well, they say that with horror movies, that that when you watch a horror movie, your lizard brain, I mean, I guess for lack of a better term, doesn't know the difference between seeing that in reality and seeing that in fiction, and that's why we get those excited feelings when we're watching Freddy or Jason carve somebody up.
Mm-hmm. Again, there's parallels to be drawn there, because of course horror movies ultimately are tapping into an underlying and ancient belief in paranormal phenomena.
Mm-hmm.
It's the idea that there is something beyond the physical which can affect the physical, and that's why horror movies continue to be so popular, albeit again certainly not with the Academy Awards. And I'm a huge horror fan, and so that's my little dig at the Oscars there for never recognizing quality movies.
Right.
But the thing with UFOs, of course, as I say, UFOs as a phenomenon, as a historical phenomenon, they're not really accepted or embraced by official culture. They're a fringe thing. Mm-hmm. And so with that in mind, when Hollywood, the most pervasive medium of our era, kind of popularizes previously fringe subcultural ideas, it does so through the science fiction genre, which is innately fantastical, and the medium itself of cinema is also fantastical.
Right.
And so we associate whatever it depicts with forms of public fantasy. So therefore, UFOs, because we don't know anything about them anyway, or because the only things we know about them is the only thing you're going to know about a UFO is if you go and buy a UFO book. You have to do some specialist research on the subject to understand.
Right. It's all conjecture.
But most people don't have that. Most people don't have the inclination or even the knowledge that this information is available. And so the only knowledge or understanding that they have of this historically real phenomenon comes to them through the lens of cinema, through a fantastical medium, and therefore whatever it depicts, something that's inherently fantastical on the surface, UFOs, are of course absolutely fictionalized through cinema. But at the same time, they're actualized because whatever cinema depicts on some level is kind of embedded into our popular consciousness and seems somehow real to us. That's the effect that cinema has. No matter what it depicts, it's somehow just through the process of being screened. It's real.
Particularly with live action special effects and stuff. When you see it as compared to when you're watching a cartoon or something, when you watch a movie. And especially when they use practical effects now too, it seems like all of a sudden everything feels more real than when it's just computer effects. It just has a different impact on our brain.
Well, what cinema does is it as I say, it narrativizes and it contextualizes events, debates, and processes that constitute our frustratingly non-narrative world. Life rarely makes sense, but movies usually do, and we take comfort in that. But therein lies the problem, because movies aren't real life. They're reflections of it, snapshots of it, simulations of it. They're skewed and distorted through the ideological framework of the people who've made them. Mm-hmm. And so we live in this hyper real world where things are simultaneously real and unreal at the same time, and there's no distinction anymore. We don't really care about the distinction anymore. And so that makes UFOs problematic, because they are inseparable now from the medium of cinema, and always have been, because I say that the modern phenomenon began in 1947 and Hollywood's depictions of it began just 3 years later in 1950. So the two have always been inseparable. And that's what I try to do in my research, is to try and sort the fact from the fantasy wherever possible. Ultimately, it's not entirely possible.
Right.
But it's interesting to try.
To follow up a little bit with what we were talking about a minute ago, is that, we talked about UFOs were it's still a popular thing, alien invasions, and especially during the Cold War, we talked about that. Do you think the focus has changed as the bad guys, quote unquote bad guys to Western culture, went from being communists to terrorists? Has that, when we talk about disinformation, or even just the way that UFOs are depicted in the cultural lens of the kind of people that we are conditioned to see as the other. I'm just wondering if that has changed our perception or how Hollywood treats alien invasion movies and stuff.
I've got a whole chapter on alien invasion, specifically looking at Hollywood's depictions of alien invasion and the aliens' invasion strategies. And again, I look at the idea of these being communist allegories during the Cold War. And then, for example, with Spielberg's War of the Worlds reboot in 2005, that was, of course, a terrorist movie. There's even a line of dialogue in there saying, "Is it terrorists?" when the aliens first strike. So it's hardly subtle. And of course, Spielberg stated publicly that the imagery in the film was intentionally reminiscent of that scene as the Twin Towers fell on 9/11. And so certainly, and then, you had Signs, Shyamalan's alien invasion movie.
Yeah, brilliant movie right up to the end.
In 2000, water intolerant aliens invading Earth. Oops.
That's a spoiler alert for a 15-year-old movie.
Oh well, everyone's seen that film. But we don't reveal how the water kills them. That's the. It's so dumb. It deserves to be ruined.
I know, because it's really good up to that point.
Yeah, there's some good stuff in it. But that had overtones of post 9/11 fears. The family home was all of a sudden under threat, and and again, this is extended to 2005 with War of the Worlds and beyond. And certainly, you can look at them like that, and obviously that's intentional. The War of the Worlds, the political angle with the War of the Worlds is, of course, that the U.S. military supported that film, and it had involvement in that film. And so, of course, if you're flagging up terrorist threats, that's of course going to be useful to the military, because again, it plays to recruitment, and because that's ultimately the goal of military involvement in the filmmaking process, is to boost recruitment and retention of personnel within the armed forces, to propagandize essentially, but they would refer to it as kind of soft propaganda. They wouldn't use the propaganda term because it's a dirty term.
Right.
other countries propagandize, right? But no one's home country propagandizes other countries propagandize. But
We're just talking about emergency preparedness.
right, it's a propaganda, but I mean, yeah. So you got War of the Worlds, Spielberg, and then you had other enemy nations or perceived enemy nations flagged up in films in the new millennium, in Transformers, Dark of the Moon, for example, which is 2011. You've got dialogue almost certainly written or encouraged by Department of Defense referring to North Korea and Iran and nuclear sites in those countries and how they must be taken out and they pose a threat, etc., etc. And this, these are films which were given total full cooperation from the Department of Defense, and again, which not coincidentally advance the myth of cooperation between American national security forces and extraterrestrials. Pretty much every film that the Department of Defense has lent its support to in the last couple of decades, in terms of UFO movies, have at the core of their narrative, had this idea of cooperation and mutual treaties between aliens and elements within the U.S. government. Now, to me, that's not really coincidental,
right? Of course,
and this began with the Stargate TV show, in about 1998, when the Department of Defense decided to lend their full support to that. And again, that was properly an extension of everything that was sown in the 1980s, where you've got grey aliens working alongside elements within the US military. They've got reverse engineered technology. They're using it to, for the benefit of all mankind. Mm-hmm. You're kind of manipulating perceptions of official involvement or interest in this field. And it's kind of a self-serving mythology, but it's also a mythology that acts in a psychological warfare way as well, to scare other nations. This is not to say that other nations will watch Stargate and think, oh man, that's,
right, MacGyver's coming for us,
right? But it's a subtle continuation, arguably, of a strategy that was enacted a couple of decades previous.
I just think it's fascinating, the idea, the idea of the, whatever quote unquote bad guy we're up against, that, we can find a way to use these science fiction and horror tropes to kind of reinforce, a political agenda through them.
Yeah, and it's not just through sci-fi as well. There's been a number of excellent books written on the subject of military involvement in the entertainment industry, and CIA involvement in the entertainment industry, and they're interested in all genres. All kinds of genres that you would never even expect would be suitable to, for propaganda. The Department of Defense has been involved in Sabrina the Teenage Witch, and
okay,
right, any kind of opportunity that they get to sell their message, to boost recruitment and retention of personnel, etc., they will use that, regardless of genre, regardless of medium.
Sure.
And computer games video games is the new frontier for that, because that's interactive, not just passive. It's an interactive experience rather than a passive visual one. But cinema continues to be viewed as a great conduit for information, disinformation, propaganda, recruitment, etc., etc. It molds people's minds. It's pervasive. It's hugely influential.
Right.
It's a kind of mystical medium. Still, it has this power to transport us, to other realms of perception. It detaches us from our sense of everyday reality.
And it sometimes it runs our lives. I find myself reading about Star Trek for 2.5 hours, like just in the middle of the afternoon. I'm like, oh my God, what happened to my day? And you realize just the kind of power that a TV show or a movie can have on you, where you can just read other people's comments on it, and that can take up hours of your life that you didn't realize you were giving over to it.
Well, the other thing is, as I say, I should keep emphasizing this idea that the power of cinema ultimately lies in its capacity to narrativize, to provide a narrative and context to events and processes and debates that otherwise are very hard to comprehend in our everyday reality.
Sure, like how many angels can dance on the head of a pin or whatever.
Well, I'm particularly interested in this in the context of historical events or phenomena. So, if I say the word Titanic, what do you think of?
Oh, I saw Kate Winslet standing at
right.
at the prow of the ship. I don't think about the crash anymore.
Right. There's going to be almost no one alive today who has any other image of Titanic other than the $2 billion movie.
Right.
Right. That film has become the event. and our understanding of the Titanic tragedy has been really shaped by James Cameron.
No, that's a good way to put it, because a lot of times when you talk about D-Day, Saving Private Ryan,
This is another example. Literally, this is an example I've used in the past. Saving Private Ryan. You can't. If you say D-Day landings, I challenge anyone kind of under the age of, I don't know, anyone who's grown up in the generation of Saving Private Ryan, like in the cinemas, which was 1998. Anyone who's seen that film, it's unerasable from your mind. You know, it's embedded there. And if you say D-Day landings, images of Saving Private Ryan come into your head.
First thing that comes in here, absolutely.
Right, and if you say, gangsters, Italian-American gangsters, you're going to think of Goodfellas or The Godfather. Mm-hmm. So something rich cultural, political history and events has simplified and been contextualized and narrativized into this iconography, essentially, through cinema. And that's great and magical, but it's also problematic when you're trying to sort fact from fiction in a historical way, and especially when it comes to phenomena and events that officially don't exist or haven't happened.
And so they kind of feed into each other. I was kind of thinking about this yesterday because I was thinking about our interview, and I was doing some reading on cults, as you do. And so I was reading about the Heaven's Gate. Mm-hmm. And if those people hadn't seen, like, Close Encounters of the Third Kind or something like that, would they really believe that aliens were going to come and pick them up if they poisoned themselves when the comet came by?
I think the short answer to that is probably yes. They would probably have done it anyway, because I've never bought into the idea that movie, like, so it's hard to explain. So movies are hugely influential in kind of a macro way, but there's very little evidence to suggest that any one movie can directly influence the behavior of an individual or a group of individuals. If you're inclined to do something crazy, you're going to do it whether you've seen a movie or played a video game. Right. The key word there was cult, and already there you're talking about brainwashing in an organized way, and a movie is going to be neither here nor there when it comes to the decisions that are being made by a cult. But as I say, movies do influence our perceptions and our assumptions, if not our actions.
That's a good way to put it. I think that's a good note to end on, because I could probably talk to you about UFOs and movies and stuff for way longer than I could just read about Star Trek. So, Robbie, where can people find the book and they can pick it up and get a copy for themselves? Because everybody's going to want to read this book, I think.
Oh, great. It's available on Amazon. You can get it through any major international seller online. It's Barnes & Noble, Amazon, all that kind of stuff. So if you just, it's available on Amazon, US, UK, Europe. It's called Silver Screen Sources, Sorting Fact from Fantasy and Hollywood UFO Movies. And you can find more information on this through articles, a huge list of UFO movies that I discuss, and other things on my website, which is just silverscreensources.uk.
And we're going to put a link to that in the show notes, and I encourage everybody to go check it out because it's really a fascinating topic. And the book's just released, so you can be the smartest one of all your friends who love UFOs and pick it up right away. So thanks very much for joining us today, Robbie. We really appreciate it.
Pleasure. Thanks very much.
Pop culture can have a big effect on our belief system. And a lot of times movies, even more so than books, because our visual sense is tied very tightly to our interpretation of reality. And that effect is the inspiration for today's song called Seeing is Believing.
Disinformation we lie to every day. Our imagination used to fool our lizard brain. The point of distraction, just a little bait and switch. Find the ball under the shell. Who knows, you might get rich. A mothership or the Empire State, a saucer on the White House lawn. Keep your eyes and forget you're being kind. If seeing is believing, then I'll get down on my knees. My head gets cracked between fiction and fact. We see what we wanna see. Your eyes play tricks and your mind's transfixed on what the screen reveals. Seeing is believing, but that doesn't make it real. Check your programming. You could use a little doubt. Keep on looking further than your eyes allow. A mothership or the Empire State, a saucer on the White House lawn. Keep your eyes upon the skies, forget you're being kind. Seeing is believing, then I'll get down on my knees. My head gets cracked between fiction and fact. We see what we wanna see. Your eyes play tricks and your mind's transfixed on what the screen reveals. Seeing is believing, but that doesn't make it real. Seeing is believing, but that doesn't make it real. Seeing is believing, but that doesn't make it real.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. You can find us online at othersidepodcast.com. Until next time, see you on the other side.
Alien superpowers